Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but I'm glad to be able to present to you in this form. Today I'll be presenting Society Must Be Self-Defended, or Inside You There Are Two Dogs, Self-Defense, Power, and the Epistemology of Ignorance. Ostensibly, 60% of Americans think they could win a fight against a sizable dog. 6% also believe they could fight a bear. While fighting bears seems ridiculous, it is indicative of part of a more mainstream milieu and overinflated assumptions about self-defense and violence. The YouTube show Ultimate Self-Defense Champion, hosted by a former Aikido practitioner who built his content brand around the realization that Aikido would not work in the street, tests martial arts influencers in self-defense scenarios. Any given martial arts training facility has a high probability of referring to self-defense as an end goal of the instruction they offer. Efficacy claims to convert training from the gym to the cage to the street. This paper combines the ordinary language philosophy of Wittgenstein with Foucauldian analysis of power to frame self-defense as a technology of forgetting, one which shores up an epistemology of ignorance necessary to maintain the opposition between civil society and the dangerous other. To make this argument, I'll first discuss Alex Channon and Christopher Matthews' kinds of violence to clarify the distinction between what most of us do in our practice of martial arts and self-defense. Then I'll look back to Thomas Hobbes through Foucault's Society Must Be Defended lectures to argue that the founding myth of self-defense violence introduces what I will call the self-defense paradox. The man, and I do mean man, who, to defeat the animalistic barbarian at the gates, must rely on the very animality that society ostensibly civilizes. And finally, building on my own work in martial arts studies on Bartitsu and in bioethics on Marion Sims, I'll posit that the way this paradox purportedly resolves, big air quotes here on resolves because it doesn't really resolve at all, is through what Charles Mills calls an epistemology of ignorance, or a basis of knowledge contingent on not knowing. Society must indeed be self-defended, that is, defended against itself. Section 1, Violence. The analytic problem at the heart of the self-defense paradox is a misconstrual of the concept of violence. As Channon and Matthews' work on violence demonstrates, academics and fighters alike often force the word into ill-fitting conceptual forms. Now, they're careful to clarify that there's no single definition, either desirable or possible. Rather, they posit we should attempt to find conceptions that are adequately theorized relative to the important contributions of all of the positions that they consider. This is the sticky part of the concept. In ordinary language, we'd consider a punch qua punch violent, but in the dojo or gym, a punch can be consensual, appropriate, or fitting, or even inappropriately uncommitted to contact. If I punch you in the face when I see you in the department office, that's a form of non-consensual, instigative, interpersonal violence. If I punch you in the face when we're kickboxing, first of all, it's probably not anything you did wrong. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I'm 2 meters tall. Second of all, it's a form of ritualized violence. It's staged, managed, deemed fitting within context-specific formal or informal norms, and an interaction to which we've both consented. That consent is complex and varied, from the explicit let's just have a flow round to the subtle communication of a pair of experienced training partners' stances, fakes, and jabs that communicate whether this will be a hard spar or a technical round. Even within consensual ritualized violence, however, there are degrees and kinds of violence. Invested in divorcing fighting and violence, Matthews and Channon emphasize the importance of violence as violation, but the modes of violence to which the victim has not consented are the most explicitly violent. To enrich that concept of violence, they point us toward Dunning's typology of violence as being comprised of a set of dynamic elements along a series of gradients: ritual or non-ritual, legitimate or illegitimate, armed or unarmed, physical or psychological, intentional, accidental, instigative, reactive, and instrumental, expressive. We can mobilize this to understand that while practicing kihon or basic moves in a dojo, or live rolling in a top MMA gym may contain these elements that might, in plain language, be associated with violence. But there's a categorical distinction between the consensual, ritualized violence of sparring and the non-consensual, violating, instigative violence that begins a self-defense encounter, and the equally non-consensual, reactive violence entailed in that defense. Channon and Matthews' valuable conceptual engineering aims to deepen and in some ways change the ways that academics use the term violence to refer to a network of differing concepts. My project here, however, aims toward conceptual analysis rather than engineering. As Wittgenstein admonishes, say that 3 times fast. As Wittgenstein admonishes, when philosophers use a word and try to grasp the essence of the thing, one must always ask oneself, is the word ever actually used this way in the language in which it is at home? The aim of philosophy, at least in Wittgensteinian philosophy, is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use. In the case of violence, this looks like accepting at face value, at first, the ordinary language use of violence to cover a consensual punch and a back alley mugging. This blanket use of the term explains at a surface level why everyone from Joe Rogan to the 70-year-old Shotokan black belt in my dojo to the former high school wrestler on the trial class at my BJJ gym thinks that they're capable of the violence of self-defense. But knowing that they use the same word for different things does little to tell us why they do. The easy answer, of course, is that they're just plain wrong, but that's neither interesting nor, I think, accurate to the extent that this ignorance is motivated from somewhere. Popular discourse around self-defense could at some point have corrected this mistake, but I'll argue that the conflation of violence with the self-defense of the self, martial practice, sport, and fighting and animality all belong to the modern dispositif that upholds the state, that, in Foucault's words, thoroughly heterogeneous ensemble consisting of discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical, moral, and philanthropic positions, in short, the said as much as the unsaid. That analysis is the goal of the rest of this paper. Section 2, War. In this section, I want to explore the Hobbesian myth of the state. I say myth here in both a sociological sense, as in meaning-making story, and also in the colloquial sense that I don't for a moment believe this is an accurate story of why communities exist. However, I do think the myth is so especially prominent in Anglo-American political discourses and imaginations, and may have so bled into the beliefs of those imperial powers that it's infected a lot more than just Britain and the US. Arch-cynic and fellow taller-than-6-foot philosopher Thomas Hobbes begins his discourse on government with the declaration, "Nature hath made men so equal in the faculties of body and mind, as that though there be found one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body or quicker mind than another, yet when all is reckoned together, the difference between man and man is not so considerable as that one man can thereupon claim to himself any benefit to which another may not pretend as well as he. And from this equality of ability ariseth hope in equality of attaining our ends, chiefly the preservation of our own lives, even and especially at the cost of someone else's." Given the relative equality of all and the relative risk of violence from any one person, Hobbes says, people enter into society by dint of their foresight of their own preservation. In short, the state emerges only in desperate response to the war behind all society, behind every individual, the war of every man against every man. Only the state quells the diffidence between equals, the lack of trust that breeds a habit of perpetual readiness for war. Except it doesn't. As Foucault argues, violence goes on even when the state has been constituted. For a man who wishes to avoid war can do so only on one condition. He must show that he's ready to wage war and is not prepared to abandon all thought of war. In this sense, the civilized man must always be at the verge of war but restrained. "Hold me back, bro," he says to the state. If we embrace this myth, which we do not need to, I think, there's a dark sense in which the play of fighting is mimetic to the ongoing warfare of the state, built across tenuous consent and an agreement that we'll all play the game of edging toward the brink without crossing over. I don't think that's even a necessary part of the stories of the state or martial arts practice, but that undercurrent of violence as part of civilization does seem to me to be necessary for martial arts as self-defense practice. The paradox that one trains to be a peaceful warrior ready to unleash violence if needs be. And against whom? Against the barbarian at the gate. This barbarian is not, Foucault admonishes, the savage who, quote, lives in a state of savagery together with other savages, and who, once he enters a relation of a social kind, quote, ceases to be a savage. Think of the myriad American narratives of indigenous people whom American imperialism absorbed and assimilated violently into American society, and so ceased to be coded as savages, or at least noble savages. The barbarian, on the contrary, cannot exist without the history of the civilization he sets ablaze, without the civilization that he aims to destroy. He emerges not out of, quote, some natural backdrop to which he belongs, but from opposition to civilization itself. And so, when the threat of violence wells up in the state's interstices at its limits and on its frontiers, it's not from savages, but from barbarians. The paradox here is that the barbarian is the civilized man par excellence. The barbarian's always ready to wage war against the constraints that he believes he does not need, unwilling to give up his freedom in return for security because, and this is the crux of it, he embraces the myth that the underpinning of the state is a constant state of war. And the fact of the matter is that the state often cannot protect the frontiers from the barbarian. Enter Batman or John Wayne or Barton Wright. The barbarian who gives up no freedom for security because he is his own security, who knows that the best defense is self-defense. The violence embedded in the Hobbesian myth of the state generates a paradox. The barbarian simply turns up that violence better than the civilized man. Part 3, ignorance. The language of violence and animality intertwine around self-defense. Those same men, presumably who want to protect themselves and their very heterosexual nuclear families from criminals, talk about having that dog in them that just makes them see red and win fights. Society is the antithesis of animal violence, but animal violence is frightening and dangerous and efficacious and also part of the state. How then can society protect itself against the incursion of the animalistic, racialized, classed other and their violent nature when it turns out that one, animal violence is part of the civilized man, and two, the barbarian's better at it? The non-answer of self-defense discourse seems to me to be ignore those paradoxes entirely by overdetermining them. Knowledge is crucial to discourses of self-defense. In my 2015 article in Victorian Literature and Culture on Barton Wright and Bartitsu, I suggested that the turn of the 20th century self-defense manuals mobilized discourses of science and systems to, quote, stage, define, and thereby control the unruly theater of the street. I just quoted myself, it's fine. Even if the actual images and manuals shared very little resemblance to actual London life, self-defense manuals choreographed an affirmation of both the power and the masculinity of the bourgeois man against the fin de siècle barbarians, hooligans, the poor, the Irish. Scientificity, deploying the rhetoric of science and an appeal to the authority of science, overdetermine the potential actions of the hooligan to make them controllable. They will attack thus, and you will respond thus, which will force them to respond in this way, etc. The rhetorical power of science makes these projections into determinations and over-determinations of those dangerous bodies. So I acknowledge the physical reality that if trained person A responds to an attack from trained person B in such a way that they check or block limbs or angles, they can limit the potential ways that person B can move. But that doesn't tell us anything about the translation of ritual consensual violence into the messiness of instigative non-consensual violence, let alone the psychological translation of the will to participate in that different kind of violence. And again, we could claim this is just an oversight, but I'm unconvinced by the just here. This is, I would argue, the cultivation of an epistemology of ignorance. This concept comes from the work of Charles Mills on white ignorance about Black people's pain. Mills writes that concepts or the lack of concepts of Black people's pain experiences drives the perception with whites intent on denying what is before them. Elizabeth Spellman, in her reading of James Baldwin, emphasizes the necessity that in white ignorance, it is not enough that S not believe P is true or false. S must also not want to believe that P is true or false. So S avoids thinking about P as much as possible. In this case, it's not enough to avoid thinking about the potential untranslatability of self-defense practice into non-consensual violence. Self-defense practitioners do not want to believe that the gym does not translate to the street. White ignorance is not only metaphorically or conceptually useful to think about in self-defense. The self-defense paradox is, I argue, part of that same dispositif of state racism and violence that produces white ignorance. In the case of white ignorance, what seems like an absence of epistemic resources may result from surplus epistemic resources, or an overdetermination of meaning-making that Channon Sullivan calls ignorance/knowledge. Ignorance may be an illusion produced by dominant groups to maintain that dominance. What looks like a gap is an overdetermination of knowledge about another group that overrides perception and logic with its own unchallengeable premises, which lead to judgments for which there is insufficient evidence. In terms of race, this looks like overdetermined knowledge about how Black people's bodies work, for example, at the expense of actually attending to their experience. In the case of self-defense, the overdetermination of the street and the ability of the civilized man to release his inner barbarian allows S not to think about P, and why would they, for they already know. Ignorance knowledge insists too much on its own coherence. In its desperation to overdetermine knowledge, it depends on premises untenable by its own epistemological standards. To reinforce racial power, in Charles Mills's words, white ignorance produces the ironic outcome that whites will in general be unable to understand the world that they themselves have made. In short, ignorance does not entail accidental, and ignorance about the necessity and inevitability of self-defense supports that founding myth of the state in perpetual war, even as it undoes it. So to put it explicitly, the myth of the state in perpetual war requires that 1, civilized man must give up on animal violence to enter into society. 2, but at the same time, the position of perpetual war requires that the civilized man be ready at any time to return to animal violence. 3, by definition, the barbarian retains animal violence via 1 and deploys it against society. And so 4, civilized man must defend society against the animal violence of the barbarian. But to do so, to defend society against the barbarian, civilized man must deploy animal violence, contra 1. But the barbarian is by definition closer and better to that animal violence via 3. And so the science of self-defense emerges to draw violence into the purview of the state and scientific society. But the discourse of self-defense is always aware and unaware, or disavowing the ignorance that makes the discourse of self-defense possible. The tangle of the self-defense paradox suggests that self-defense is an ideology that has run away with itself. While it's directed at the barbarian, a palimpsest on which white masculinity can write the dangerous flavor of the era against which society must be defended, it remains unclear exactly for whom the discourse of self-defense is actually working. The answer I suggest is nobody. Instead, it's a paradox born of the myth of the state in perpetual war, kind of epiphenomenon that traps its practitioners as much as, or more, as it produces violence against the ostensible barbarian. Because again, the self-defense practitioner turns out to just be a less effective barbarian unless they go fully animal. As Foucault reminds us regularly, truth isn't outside power or lacking in power. It is produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint. This is why I advocate for a project of conceptual analysis as much as conceptual engineering. Rather than try to separate truth from power, we might instead excavate the ways that our language is embedded within hegemonic relays of that power. In Society Must Be Defended, Foucault writes that, quote, power is exercised through networks, and individuals do not simply circulate in those networks. They're in a position to both submit to and exercise this power. They're never the inert or consenting targets of power, they're always its relays. White ignorance produced by the flows of the dispositif we call the state turns back against itself. As Americans are fond of proving repeatedly, the ideology of self-defense directly physically affects marginalized bodies, from stand your ground laws to police violence to the rhetorical and real violence of the election happening literally right now that I'm trying not to think about. Confronting this real violence is an important task of justice, but it's also an important project of justice to detach the power of truth from this hegemonic violence, to confront the intentional ignorance at the heart of self-defense. Because the self-defense paradox is a self-destruction machine that turns bodies against themselves. Thank you, and I'll see you in person momentarily.